Let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you guys all for coming. This is like kind of shocking. I know, like at Vassar, people are always like, oh, come on there, but you don't actually expect that. So thank you. This is kind of this stuff. I'd also like to first just acknowledge, I have a lot of people to thank actually, so I'll just try to keep it brief. All the Russian professors, especially Professor Arndt, who's been my thesis advisor, as well as Professor Cherkasova, who's been my advisor for 4 years here at Vassar. I can't thank you guys enough. I definitely wouldn't be the student and person I am today if not for you guys and your mentorship. I'd also like to thank the bands. You guys didn't know how many times I said thank you, but just like seriously, so deep down, thank you. You guys are troopers. As well as everyone for coming, my friends, I just really appreciate it. I feel like I also maybe have to explain the name of this thesis real quick because I came up with it last night. It's called Blue Notes for a Red Revolution. A blue note is essentially, in the context of like a scale that you're playing, a blue note is kind of like an off-pitch note. So like very typical in jazz, it stems from blues music. And I just thought that contrast between blue and red was kind of poetic. So why did I choose this topic? Ultimately, it's a synthesis of my two favorite areas of interest here at Vassar, music and Russian. I knew I wanted to be a Russian major since before I got here. I was pretty dead set on that. And I've also been in the jazz combos and the big bands throughout my time here, so it just sort of felt natural. And thank you again to the Russian Department for allowing me to have such a creative project. But I also think this topic is worthwhile on its own for both the study of jazz and the history of the USSR. Jazz is undeniably a very American form of music. It comes from ragtime and blues across black communities in the South. And that cultural context is pretty different from what most people found themselves in the early Soviet Union. So if you're a fan of jazz, I think it's kind of worthwhile to study how jazz is reinterpreted and reimagined in different cultural contexts. And additionally, it can allow us to understand better the history of the Soviet Union, how the Soviet ideology responded to certain threats, especially foreign threats, the nuances and the debates around Soviet ideology. And I would also argue that jazz in the USSR was emblematic of the forces that ultimately led to the collapse of the system. Long before 1991, the ideal of communism, the capital C, had been really replaced by an intimation of like the general, genuinely popular culture that swept across the world in the 20th century, especially in the West. And that's not to say that the Soviets experienced this in the same way, to the same extent, because they didn't. But this culture came from below to a large extent. It was, shaped by the tastes of artists and audiences, and that's something that's sort of liberatory in a way that the state-sponsored Soviet culture simply could never match. So I'm not arguing that jazz like itself was one of the reasons that the Soviet Union fell. That's like much more like nationalism and a decaying bureaucracy. But it represents that broader culture that led to the collapse. So jazz was first recorded in 1917 in New York City by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And just a few weeks later, there were spontaneous protests in, it was called Petrograd at the time, I actually don't know, St. Petersburg, which ultimately led to the collapse of the Tsarist system. And from this political chaos, the opportunistic Bolshevik faction performed what I would argue is probably the most consequential coup in human history. It's the first socialist revolution, leading to the Soviet Union. But first, there was a big civil war, absolutely decimated the country. And as a result of this civil war and World War I, jazz arrived really late to the Soviet Union. It wasn't until 1922 that jazz was first played. And it wasn't played by an American touring band like in France, Belgium, but it was actually brought by a Russian. His name was Valentin Parnach. He was not a musician, he was an avant-garde artist. He was born to a Jewish family on the coast of the Azov Sea in southern Russia, and he discovered jazz in Paris in 1921. He left Paris quickly after that because he had beef with the Russian emigres there. They were all white Russians, and he actually had socialist sympathies. So he went back to the Soviet Union, brought back instruments, scores, recording equipment, and established the first Soviet jazz band, which was delightfully named the first eccentric orchestra of the Russian Federated Socialist Republic, Valentin Parnach's Jazz Band. Yeah, so by October of that year, they were playing their first concert. To mixed reviews in Moscow, critics kind of didn't understand it. They thought it was either like really cacophonous noise, or they much more perniciously represented like moral decay of bourgeois society and unbridled sexuality, lack of apparent political message. Supporters, meanwhile, argued actually this could usher in the next frontier in the development of proletarian culture. And these contrasting ideas about jazz formed the crux of the debate surrounding the genre really throughout its time in the USSR, but especially in the introduction and throughout the period of Stalin. On the one hand, jazz definitely, as an ideology, clashes with Soviet ideology. I would argue jazz is about doing what you want, when you want, how you want, and this is simply not going to cut it in the early Soviet Union. You know, things had to get done. People, like, buildings had to get built, roads, houses, people need to be fed. So the music that the Soviets wanted to promote was like these like hoorah worker songs. Furthermore, a lot of the Soviet jazz men engaged in these like the worst aspects of bourgeois culture, like excessive drinking, excessive gambling, swearing, general bohemian lifestyles, and the revolution hadn't been all for this, right? But on the other hand, jazz quite literally is proletarian music. I mean, it's the music of the most oppressed people in America. And as jazz became more popular across the Soviet Union, this argument gathered merit because jazz was one of the few genres that was able to become, you know, like genuinely popular music for the masses that they enjoyed. Jazz really took off around like 1925, and between 1925 and 1928 were known as the Russian Roaring 20s. Famous jazzmen such as Alexander Tzvasman, Leopold Teplitsky, Boris Krupchev, Georgy Landsberg, Oleg Lundstrom, etc. helped popularize the genre, even gaining official patronage from the state. And I would argue that this has to do with the political climate at the time. This was during the period of the new economic policy, which Lenin implemented pretty quickly in the Civil War because he realized that most people actually were not fans of the Bolsheviks, and the austere socialism of war communism was not going to cut it. So basically this allowed for small-time independence for entrepreneurs and labor unions, and this climate of tolerance reflected the development of Soviet culture at the time. This all radically shifted during the first five-year plan initiated by Stalin in 1928. His ideology was really one more of like chauvinism and communist internationalism, and as a consequence of this, really foreign influences started to be looked upon with extreme suspicion, and jazz, unsurprisingly, got caught up in this. All forms of private organizations and amateur groups were excluded from public art, which effectively killed off the existing basis for popular initiative in music. And the decisive moment of politicization came in 1928 when Maxim Gorky, the famous Soviet author, wrote a piece entitled The Music of the Gross, in which he argued that, well, he argued the first proletarian case against jazz, that it stemmed from like a personal conflict he had with his neighbor in Italy. He didn't like the way that his neighbor in Italy played jazz too loud, but regardless. He claimed that the unbridled sexuality of jazz was both a cause and a symptom of the collapse of Western society. It made men obese, it made men homosexual, it made men abusive to women. He also very strangely argued that black people in America actually knew this and they were sort of purposefully inflicting this upon their white people. He said, undoubtedly, they laugh in their sleeves to see how their white masters are evolving towards the savagery which they themselves are leaving behind. So it's safe to say that he really did not understand jazz that much. But he did understand one thing about jazz, that it was, in essence, it's about dancing, it's about movement, it's physical emancipation, and this is not going to cut it. This is not mesh with the strictness of the Cultural Revolution. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, this attitude began to change. First, there was a lack of genuinely popular music in the USSR, so it was one thing to make a case against jazz, it's another thing to try and find a replacement for it. And second, the Nazis came to power, and they were extremely opposed to jazz in very racist and anti-Semitic lines of attack. And so the Soviet authorities figured, oh, well, if these are arch enemies, maybe jazz isn't all so bad. So in a strange way, the Cultural Revolution and the first five-year plan began by condemning jazz and ended by uplifting at least a sanitized version that was sort of fit for Soviet ideology. This leads us to our first artist, a man named Leonid Utyosov. He was born in Odessa, Ukraine, to a Jewish family. And he became a very popular singer in the 1930s. Actually became the first pop singer in the USSR to win the award People's Artist of the USSR. Part of the reason he was able to maintain good graces is he sort of undermines the jazz of things going to work. So critics of him and jazz purists are not necessarily a big fan of him. But as an opportunist, he was able to not only survive but thrive in a very tumultuous time. Just accidentally put it on the right. And he's also popular because he started a movie called Vasily, which translates roughly to like cheerful fellows or jolly guys or whatever. And it's a Soviet jazz comedy and features one of his most popular songs called Serdtse, which translates to heart. This film is adored by the youth and also Stalin, weirdly, he watched it several times. But this song, Heart, is a carefree, simple tune about love and how your heart can become captivated by just one person, even though there are so many people out there. And now I'd like to invite the band and my friend Mya onto the stage to perform. So a few notes on how this exactly fits into the Soviet ideology at the time. First, you'll notice pretty obviously there was no improvisation on that track. This was like basically strictly forbidden. I mean, that's like extremely taboo, very much a bourgeois element of jazz, or at least considered at the time. Another thing is the lyrical content. This song talks about good girls in Russian, but I interpret good as like well-behaved or well-mannered, sort of like upholding this image of like the socialist person. Overall, I mean, it was like jazzy, but it's not that jazzy. And so, probably one of the reasons that Stalin actually enjoyed it that much is that there's not that much deviation from, what's to be expected. So the first 5-year plan was completed in only 4, and Stalin claimed the country was dizzy from success. In reality, he really unleashed an open war on the countryside. Millions died in artificial famines from Ukraine to southern Russia to Kazakhstan. But following 1932, there was a brief but genuine period of feelings of joy. Jazz exploded in popularity at this time. There was just a general sense of relief, okay, we've made it out. And Stalin, in fact, patroned certain musicians. One of them was Leonid Utyosov. He was considered one of Stalin's jazz men. Another one was a man named Alexander Vasily. Jazz came to signal a sort of carefree, easygoing way of life. And one Soviet contemporary writer even opined that the jazz epidemic is to some degree a natural reaction to the excessively austere Puritanism that reigned among us until so recently. So new forms of jazz were popping up everywhere. There was cinema jazz, theater jazz, jazz operetta, king jazz. I don't even know what king jazz is. Essentially, the term became a marketing gimmick from the period of 1932 to 1936. This period became known as the Red Jazz Age. In 1937, Stalin initiated the Great Purge. World War II, started in 1939. So jazz was plunged into a period of deep chaos. On the one hand, a lot of musicians, especially those with foreign connections, were arrested, exiled, and even killed. And that was the crux of the issue. It wasn't about if you were a jazz player or not. It was, are you a jazz player who has connections to foreign countries? Gorky died in 1936, and so his arguments also reappeared, his music of the gross idea. And yet, World War II offered a lot of relief for jazz musicians because, well, jazz was popular, and it became a really easy way to entertain the Soviet soldiers on the front lines. Additionally, with the alliance with the USA, even though it was brief, it strengthened the view of jazz in the Soviet public. So this leads us to a man named Ady Rosner, who his experience in Soviet jazz scene really exemplifies the perils of working in the genre during the time. He was born to a Jewish family in Berlin, developed an interest in jazz from a young age. Once the Nazis came to power, he decided to move to Poland. And then they invaded Poland, and so he fled to Belarus, found himself living in the USSR. He started a big band, which became the state orchestra of Belarus, even had the approval of Stalin himself to go tour the USSR, entertaining troops and party officials. What he's known for in the Soviet Union is popularizing a lot of American jazz standards, from things such as St. Louis blues to Caravan. After the war, unfortunately, he was caught at the western border of Ukraine, trying to escape back to Poland. He was charged with betraying his fatherland and sent to a gulag prison camp in the Far East in a place called Magadan for 10 years. On the camp, he sort of became a prisoner with special status because he could entertain everyone, and the head of the camp really enjoyed the way that he played. He was eventually released 1 year after Stalin's death, continued to work as a trained musician, but he was essentially blacklisted. He never got to play in the big theaters again. Oftentimes the media would neglect to mention him. And at the end of his life, he was allowed to immigrate back to Berlin, where he died in poverty because he earned no royalties from the Soviet Union. So now to honor his life, we are going to play a rendition of the tune Caravan, which was initially composed by Duke Ellington. Jewish element of Soviet jazz, which was really absolutely a core component of how jazz developed in the Soviet Union. Basically, all of the early pioneers of the genre, from Valentin Parmenov to Leonid Utyosov, Alexander Stassman, Ady Rosner, Georgy Landsberg, Leopold Teplitsky, were all Jewish, most of whom were born in regions formerly known as the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, where Jews were restricted to live. Much of that is modern-day Poland and Ukraine. There's little analysis, especially in English, on why the early jazz pioneers were Jewish in the USSR, which means that I have to speculate a bit. But if I had to, I would argue that the main reason is because jazz is really an urban genre of music, and the Jewish population was quite heavily urbanized in the Russian Empire and the USSR, reflecting the fast-paced, chaotic bustle of the city. And also, a lot of, this is a little bit more speculation, but I saw this from one Jewish website, so I'm going to take it and run with it. That the sort of traditional Ashkenazi and Yiddish like melodies and tunes have those blue notes in them, and they have sort of these elements of jazz and syncopation. So there's an argument that Jewish musicians were simply more adept, more used to these rhythms, so they were able to really master them. Following World War II, jazz experienced renewed attacks from Stalin because it turns out that his love for jazz is not as much as his love for paranoia and anti-Semitism. Another influence was the Cold War in the USSR. Maybe one day, but the USA. As an American tradition, jazz was responded with really extreme skepticism. And most of the prominent jazz musicians were once again arrested, and those who weren't, such as our boy Stassman, he was stripped of his prestigious positions as a band leader. This led to a bit of a lull in the development of Soviet jazz until after Stalin's death. When Stalin died, Khrushchev came to power, and his ideology of peaceful coexistence with the West meant that jazz was once again able to thrive in a positive climate for like 2 years. It turns out that he didn't really enjoy jazz that much. He said it gave him gas in his stomach. However, the genie had been let out of the bottle, and there was no return to Stalinism. So therefore, the proliferation of jazz really, from here on out, becomes too much to really even talk about it as like a unified, coherent narrative. So the next tune we'll play is called Podmoskovnye Vechera, or Evenings in a Moscow Suburb by Vasily Solovyov-Sedoi. I translated this as Moscow Nights. I think just sort of out of like nostalgia. There used to be a Russian store that was like by my house called Moscow Nights, and it was really sketchy. Like once I went and bought candy there, it was 24 cents, and I gave the guy a quarter, and I was like, keep the change. And he pushed the penny back, and he was like, not my penny, your penny. So I really wish that place still existed. I would love to go and just like talk to them and hang out. So why have I chosen this song? Besides that, well, this tune was originally written in 1956, and it was very popular, but it was not a jazz tune. It was later discovered in 1960 by a Dutch and English jazz band, and they released it, called Midnight in Moscow, in 1961 as a jazz tune. And from here, its popularity exploded. It actually peaked at #2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March of 1962 in the United States. So this song thus is a really important example of the Russian jazz standard, which gained international popularity and acceptance. Let's run it. out my second time. So something to note is that jazz developed in its own unique ways across the various different republics in the USSR. I mean, there's over like 100 different ethnicities that constituted the Soviet Union. There were 15 or 16 constituent ethnic republics. And aside from Odessa, one of the biggest hubs in the Soviet Union was Baku, Azerbaijan. Once again, there's little writing on the subject, so I'm forced to speculate, but I believe that it became a hub for jazz because even before the Soviet Union came to power, it was a cosmopolitan international city. As far back as the 1890s, they discovered oil and it became extremely wealthy and prosperous as a result. And I think jazz just flourishes in urban areas, basically. In fact, today jazz still has really significant meaning to the culture. It's really considered part of the national culture, and the Baku International Jazz Festival attracts hundreds of artists and thousands of people every year. So we're now going to play two songs from Azerbaijani composers, highlighting the different ways in which these composers approach jazz with respect to their own ethnic background. The first tune is called In Bayati-Kurd Harmony by Rafiq Babayev. He debuted the song in 1967 at the Tallinn Jazz Festival in Estonia. To great praise because of his use of what's called the Bayati-Kurd maqam, which is essentially a type of classical Arabic scale or musical mode used for improvisation. This is a horrible oversimplification, but for our purposes, it's a pretty satisfactory explanation. And this particular scale sounds like it sounds like. So yeah, he's highlighting his ethnic background as an Azerbaijani musician and incorporating his own country's traditional culture into the song. So we're now going to play. Oh, and it starts with bass solo. So. called Na Pichalia, or On the Pier, by Rudolf Kazhlaev, recorded in 1973. Kazhlaev was well known for incorporating elements of his own Caucasus culture. He was ethnically Vlach into his music, but he was also known for incorporating progressive elements of American and international jazz into his compositions. The next song, therefore, demonstrates the emergence of the popular jazz scene of the USSR, which was heavily influenced by American funk music in the mid to late 60s. And funk is my favorite genre to play on bass, so that's like the most people like chose this song. On the pier. Yes, yeah, So at this point in the USSR, jazz had largely been superseded by rock as the sort of most popular form of American music in the Soviet Union. However, while rock was often scorned by cultural critics and authorities, jazz actually maintained a relatively healthy status among Soviet society during this period, especially among the cultural elite. One of the most popular jazz men in the 1980s was a saxophone, probably the most popular, I can say that, the most popular saxophonist, jazzman in the 1980s was a saxophonist by the name of Nikolai Leonovsky, also Jewish, born in Saratov, Russia. In 1978, he established his ensemble called Allegro, or in Russian, Vechera, which quickly rose to prominence as one of the most popular bands in the USSR. In fact, they won that award, Best Ensemble in the USSR, during the 80s, and he himself won the award for Best Musician of the Year 4 times throughout that period. At this point in its development in the USSR, they're just too similar. At this point in the USA, jazz really leaned into fusion with other genres like funk, R&B, and rock, and this was mostly to stay commercially relevant. In the USSR, this wasn't necessarily a problem because everything was like a state contract, but I would argue that leaning into fusion kept jazz culturally relevant, especially against the ever-increasing influence of rock music. So Leonovsky is considered a pioneer of the jazz fusion genre in the USSR, and will now play one of the most popular tracks called Vechera, or In This World, from 1982. knew that was going to be the most popular part of the class. So to round out our study on Soviet jazz, I would like to take you to Estonia in 1990. The atmosphere was one of increasing nationalism and disdain for the inertia and the authoritarianism of Soviet rule. This was helped in large part due to the policies of Glasnost and Perestroika, which allowed for open criticism to an extent which had never been seen before in the Soviet system. This song that we'll play is called Last Year I Went to the Herd, or Mogu Mina Mwedu Karyas Kaisen by Helmut Aniko. I chose this track for two reasons. First, I really like it, but more importantly, I believe the song was influenced by the political climate quite greatly. Because just 1 year prior to the song's release in 1990, the government of Estonia declared legal independence from the Soviet Union, essentially declaring that no Soviet law could override any sort of Estonian law. This song is a traditional Estonian folk tune. It was did long before the Soviet Union did, and Aniko even sings it at the beginning. I'm not going to sing it for you, but he sings it in the Estonian language using a traditional instrument called the jalaharp. So I speculate that he was at least partly inspired by the political situation around him when he made this record. And I think it's a fitting end to our concert, and made basically on a tune which appears to at least imply or call into question the legitimacy of the Soviet system. Because even though jazz is eventually accepted and upheld across the Soviet music scene, as a genre it still possessed those, those inherent qualities emblematic of the forces which led to the regime's collapse. Thank you all so much for coming and listening tonight, and I hope you enjoy our last piece. On saxophone, Jason Albaum. Seixas on guitar. And wonderful Alex Koester on drums. We go way back. You all know it. And also shout out to Mya Kahle.
coming. Let's give it once more with the jazz combo and Mya Kahle. Truly wonderful. I remember being in a jazz group in Petersburg and people all over the world enjoying jazz as you have, and let's hope we can unite the world again. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much again. Wonderful. Thank you guys for supporting Emmett, and thank you Emmett for doing this wonderful senior project.